Hi, Scarlet Marvel here, and Women's History Month has arrived. So, it's time for me to continue my series on Marvel heroes of different identities, with the history of Marvel's women superheroes. Black Widow, Storm, Invisible Woman, and Scarlet Witch have all become household names as fan-favorite superheroes. But most people may not be aware of how these heroes, and more, became the powerful and complex characters that they are today. Marvel's women heroes were not always the impactful and realistic women we now know them as. In fact, it took Marvel a long journey full of ups and downs to reach the modern age, where women heroes finally stand alongside men as equals. So join me as we discover the 80-year history of Marvel's women superheroes. But before we get started, why don't you let me know who your favorite woman superhero is down in the comments below. Contrary to what one might expect, the Golden Age of comics featured several women heroes in supporting and leading roles. In 1940, Marvel's predecessor, Timely Comics, introduced Clairvoyant, the original Black Widow, who was Timely's first woman hero and the first costumed superheroine in comics overall. 2 years later, Miss America was introduced, and quickly gained her own solo comic, becoming Timely's signature woman superhero. Miss America Comics also introduced Patsy Walker, a romance heroine whose success kickstarted Timely's romance comics, including Millie the Model, a Patsy Walker series, and a variety of spin-offs. Returning to superhero comics, several women sidekicks were also introduced, including Golden Girl, Miss Patriot, Namora, and Sun Girl. In the late 40s, Namora, Sun Girl, and new heroes, Blonde Phantom and Venus, received their own solo comics, as Timely worked to increase their number of women-led superhero comics. In the 1950s, Timely became Atlas, and the Comics Code Authority was created, placing heavy restrictions on how women could be portrayed in comic books. As such, the only women-led comics that survived were Timely's romance comics. These were joined by Lorna the Jungle Girl and Jan of the Jungle, Atlas's signature Jungle Girl comics, a popular genre of the decade. Due to the Comics Code Authority, the newly renamed Marvel Comics introduced few women heroes in the 1960s, with most playing supporting roles in teen comics. These characters began as shallow stereotypes, but they increased in depth and importance as the decade progressed. The most prominent women of this decade represented Marvel's main three superhero teams: Invisible Girl of the Fantastic Four, Wasp of the Avengers, and Jean Grey, aka Marvel Girl, of the X-Men. Each of these women went from love interests that often needed saving, to complex and intelligent key team players. Wasp is also noteworthy for co-starring alongside Ant-Man in Tales to Astonish. Other superheroines of the decade began their journeys as villains, with Black Widow, Scarlet Witch, and Medusa fighting Iron Man, the X-Men, and the Fantastic Four, respectively, before switching sides. Scarlet Witch then joined the Avengers, Black Widow became an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., and Medusa was revealed as Queen of the Inhumans. Towards the end of the decade, Crystal, an Inhuman princess, joined the Fantastic Four after Invisible Girl gave birth to her first child. And Lorna Dane, later known as Polaris, joined the X-Men. Aside from these superheroines, most women of Marvel's Silver Age were introduced as basic love interests. Some had sparks of heroic capacity, like Clea, Sif, Peggy Carter, and Sharon Carter. But most maintained passive roles, such as Betty Ross, Jane Foster, Pepper Potts, Gwen Stacy, Mary Jane Watson, and Carol Danvers. Despite this, by modern day, all of these women have become superheroes in some capacity. Lastly, Invisible Girl starred in Fantastic Four, Marvel's first animated series. In the 1970s, Marvel began to expand the diversity of its comics, with a focus on increasing the number of women heroes across every section of the Marvel Universe. Early in the decade, Black Widow starred in Amazing Adventures, before becoming the co-protagonist of the Daredevil comics, renamed Daredevil and the Black Widow. Around the same time, Marvel introduced 3 short-lived solo woman hero comics: The Cat, Night Nurse, and Shauna the She-Devil. During this decade, Marvel expanded various corners of their universe. New cosmic heroes included Valkyrie, Moondragon, Mantis, and Gamora. The horror corner introduced Jennifer Kale, Satana, Lilith, the daughter of Dracula, Topaz, and reintroduced the Cat as Tigra, the Werewoman, in her own solo comic, Marvel Chillers. Lastly, Kung Fu Comics introduced Colleen Wing and Misty Knight, together known as the Daughters of the Dragon. The 70s also brought the end of Marvel's romance comics, with the 207th and final issue of Millie the Model, which set the still unbroken record as Marvel's longest-running women-led series. Additionally, Patsy Walker transitioned out of romance comics, becoming the superhero Hellcat. The late 70s introduced several superheroines in their own solo comics, as counterparts to men. The first was Carol Danvers, returning as Miss Marvel, in a series known for its strong feminist themes. After this, Red Sonja was introduced as counterpart to Conan the Barbarian, followed by Jessica Drew as the original Spider-Woman. Lastly, Jennifer Walters made her debut as the Savage She-Hulk. This decade also featured a large variety of superhero teams, with many women joining each. Medusa joined the Fantastic Four, Black Widow, Mantis, Moondragon, Hellcat, and Miss Marvel joined the Avengers. Valkyrie, Clea, Hellcat, Wasp, and new hero Red Guardian joined the Defenders. The Guardians of the Galaxy introduced Alida Ogard and Nikki. The Eternals introduced Cersei and Thena. The Invaders introduced Spitfire, and Black Widow led the Champions, which also introduced Darkstar. The most impactful team of the decade was the X-Men, whose highly successful 1975 relaunch introduced the incredibly popular and powerful Storm as mainstream comics' first Black woman superhero. This series also powered up Jean Grey as the Phoenix and introduced a variety of new women heroes separate from the team itself, including Amanda Sefton, Cosmic Heroes Lilandra and Hepzibah, and Alpha Flight members Aurora and Snowbird. This run of the X-Men would continue through the 1980s, and is often regarded as a major turning point in positive representation for women. Other heroines introduced in the 70s include Mockingbird, Namorita, Betsy Braddock, and several villains who would eventually become heroes, including Thundra, Nightshade, Moonstone, Yocasta, Mystique, Black Cat, and Screaming Mimi. In animation, Invisible Girl returned in New Fantastic Four, and Spider-Woman was released as Marvel's first woman-led cartoon. The 1980s initially continued the previous decade's efforts to increase the amount of women heroes, also creating more complex storylines and varied roles for their superheroines, to mixed results. However, by the end of the decade, signs began to point towards the incoming reversal of women representation. Early in the decade, disco-singing superhero Dazzler received her own comic series, continuing the late 70s trend of new woman-led comics. Additionally, Black Widow received another solo feature in Marvel fanfare. Also at the start of the decade, Jean Grey became the Dark Phoenix in X-Men's iconic Dark Phoenix saga, one of the most well-known comic stories of all time. This storyline saw Jean confront her own morality as she struggles to responsibly manage her godly power. Throughout the decade, X-Men remained the main comic to find realistic and powerful women heroes, with new members including Kitty Pryde, Rogue, Rachel Summers, Betsy Braddock as Psylocke, and Dazzler. X-Men also produced several spin-offs, most prominently the New Mutants, which featured new heroes Karma, Mirage, Wolfsbane, Magma, Magic, Skids, and Boom Boom. Another spin-off, Alpha Flight, introduced Marina, Vindicator, and Talisman. Looking towards the Avengers, the decade began with Miss Marvel leaving the team after a controversial storyline where she was sexually assaulted by supervillain Marcus. Carol Danvers then became an ally of the X-Men and adopted the new name Binary before leaving for space. In her absence, the Avengers roster was filled by other women heroes, including Tigra, She-Hulk, Mockingbird, and new heroes Firebird and Monica Rambeau as Captain Marvel. The Fantastic Four also expanded their roster, with She-Hulk and new heroes Frankie Ray as Nova and Sharon Ventura as Miss Marvel or She-Thing. Additionally, the Invisible Girl updated her name to Invisible Woman and became leader of the Fantastic Four. In fact, all three major teams were led by women throughout the decade, with Wasp and Captain Marvel leading the Avengers, and Storm leading the X-Men. The final noteworthy team of the 80s was Power Pack, a team of child siblings that included Katie and Julie Power. Several women heroes received solo or team-up comics in this decade, including Magic, Dakota North, Firestar, Vision and the Scarlet Witch, Cloak and Dagger, and Kitty Pryde and Wolverine. Other women heroes introduced in the 80s include Yukio, Megan, Julia Carpenter as the second Spider-Woman, Andromeda, Silver Sable, Persuasion, and various villains who would later become heroes, such as Emma Frost, Sage, Elektra, Destiny, Siren, Callisto, Lyja, Diamondback, Nebula, Spiral, Frenzy, and Yellowjacket. Late in the decade, women heroes became overly sexualized, and their stories became more shallow, with various examples of women being used as props rather than as their own characters. Additionally, few women heroes were being introduced, with only Big Bertha and Jubilee as prominent examples. The 1989 relaunch of She-Hulk, titled Sensational She-Hulk, capitalized on the time period by using fourth wall breaking meta humor to expose and make fun of the many problems with the representation of women in comics. Because of this, it was seen as a feminist series. But it was also controversial for simultaneously complying with the issues it made fun of. Marvel did little outside of comics in this decade, but Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends is noteworthy for introducing Firestar, who made her comic debut later the same decade. Marvel's 1990s were a turbulent time, with big highs and even bigger lows. One low point of the decade was the representation of women heroes, who, for the most part, became little more than sex symbols appealing to the male gaze. Despite this, women heroes remained present throughout the decade, and towards the end, positive portrayals of superheroines re-emerged. Early in the decade, Silver Sable and the Wild Pack joined Sensational She-Hulk as the main woman-led comics. Marvel's UK branch also launched 2 new heroines in their own comics, Dark Angel and Motormouth, but both series were cancelled within 2 years. Sensational She-Hulk was also cancelled, setting the record for mainline Marvel's longest-lasting woman-led superhero comic, at 60 issues, a record that remains to this day. Around this time, Scarlet Witch and Julia Carpenter as Spider-Woman received their own limited series. The X-Men and their spin-offs remained the most successful comics of the decade, with many new heroines introduced, such as Feral, Domino, Cerise, Copycat, Quanin, Husk, Blink, Monet St. Croix, Marrow, and Dr. Cecilia Reyes. Several women joined the X-Men team itself, including Jubilee, Quanin, Dr. Cecilia Reyes, and Marrow. Due to X-Men's success, related heroines made up a large number of the women-led comics this decade, including Storm, Domino, Kitty Pryde, and Phoenix in a team-up comic with Cyclops. The X-Books featured some of the worst and best stories for women representation. On the good side, Emma Frost had a complex and realistic transition from villain to hero, while on the bad side, Betsy Braddock and Quanin were forced to switch bodies, enforcing the trope of women lacking bodily autonomy. More women heroes were introduced across other team comics, including Silhouette and Turbo in New Warriors, Joystick, Jolt, and Dallas Riordan in Thunderbolts, Huntara in Fantastic Four, and Deathcry and Silverclaw in Avengers. The Fantastic Four was noteworthy for Invisible Woman's poor portrayal compared to previous decades, made obvious through her overly revealing costume that is often cited as one of the worst superhero redesigns. At the end of the decade, Invisible Woman gave birth to her second child, future hero Valeria Richards. The Avengers also had their share of controversial storylines, with Scarlet Witch receiving a power upgrade, only to be regularly controlled by supervillains, and Carol Danvers returned to the Avengers, but struggling with alcohol abuse. Several women joined the Avengers, including Cersei, Julia Carpenter as Spider-Woman, Crystal, and Firestar. The Thunderbolts brought back villains Moonstone and Screaming Mimi as heroes, now named Meteorite and Songbird respectively. Marvel also explored the multiverse, with Mayday Parker as Spider-Girl, American Dream, Wild Thing, and Ricky Barnes, all coming from alternate realities. Spider-Girl was particularly popular, spawning her own self-titled series and comic line MC2, after debuting in an issue of What If. Other heroines introduced this decade include Squirrel Girl, Lynn Michaels as the Punisher, Okoye, Maddie Franklin as Spider-Woman, and Echo. The women of the late 90s, such as Spider-Girl and Echo, are noteworthy for being much more complex and positive examples of women heroes than those of the early 90s. The late 90s also brought more women-led comics, including Elektra and Black Widow. Throughout the 90s, Marvel expanded outside of comics more than ever before, with several superheroines featuring prominently across their animated series, including Storm, Jean Grey, Rogue, Jubilee, Scarlet Witch, Spider-Woman, Invisible Woman, Black Cat, She-Hulk, Wasp, and Tigra. The 2000s saw Marvel reverse many of the problematic trends that plagued heroines in the previous decade. Women starred in many of their own comics and enjoyed more realistic characterization. Despite this, women heroes still remained secondary to men and continued to be over-sexualized, although toned down significantly from the 90s. Early in the decade, Marvel explored how heroines deal with trauma and abuse, with Elsa Bloodstone in Bloodstone, and Jessica Jones in the critically acclaimed Alias. Scarlet Witch became a villain as a result of a mental breakdown that, while controversial, resulted in one of Marvel's biggest events of all time, House of M, where Scarlet Witch altered all of reality, proving herself to be one of Marvel's most powerful characters. The other prominent woman Avenger of the decade was Carol Danvers, who returned to the identity of Miss Marvel, received her own long-lasting comic series, and became a core member of the Avengers team. Other heroines joined the Avengers as well, including Silverclaw, Echo, Yocasta, and new heroes Captain Britain and Cassie Lang as Stature. Prior to joining the Avengers, Stature was part of the Young Avengers, which also introduced Kate Bishop as Hawkeye. Another young hero team of the decade was the Runaways, which introduced Nico Minoru, Carolina Dean, Molly Hayes, Gertrude Yorks, and Old Lace. The X-Men comics remained the place where the most new heroines were introduced, including Omega Sentinel, Nocturne, Negasonic Teenage Warhead, Stacy X, the Stepford Cuckoos, Angel Salvador, Dead Girl, Dust, Outlaw, Mercury, Wallflower, Winddancer, Armor, Abigail Brand, Loa, Pixie, Surge, Trance, X-23, Blindfold, Layla Miller, and Hope Summers. The X-Men team itself also expanded dramatically, with the most noteworthy women to join being Mirage, Emma Frost, Mystique, Magic, and Domino. X-Men characters made up a large number of women solo comics in this decade, including Blink, Emma Frost, Mystique, Domino, Jubilee, Rogue, X-23, Storm, and Psylocke. The Fantastic Four also had new women members, including Namorita, Storm, and Valeria Richards. This decade saw the start of a trend that would grow in the following decade: women adopting men's heroic mantles. Angela Del Toro became White Tiger, and Shuri became Black Panther, both starring in their own comics. On the theme of adopting mantles, Monica Chang became Black Widow in the Ultimate Marvel Universe, and Lyra became the second She-Hulk in her own comic series. Other heroines to receive their own comics include Black Widow, Elektra, Tigra, She-Hulk, Shauna the She-Devil, Daughters of the Dragon, Hellcat, Ricky Barnes as Nomad, and Jessica Drew as Spider-Woman. Additionally, in the MC2 universe, American Dream received her own series, and Spider-Girl's comic was cancelled at 100 issues, setting the record as Marvel's longest women-led superhero comic, although not mainline Marvel's longest, due to being in an alternate reality. Marvel also created a couple all-women hero teams, both in their own comics. First was Witches, made up of Jennifer Kale, Topaz, and Satana, followed by Marvel Divas, with a roster of Hellcat, Monica Rambeau, Black Cat, and Firestar. Marvel Divas was part of Marvel's expansion at the end of the decade to create comics specifically appealing to girls that included Black Widow and the Marvel Girls, and the return of Millie the Model in Models Inc. Other women heroes introduced in this decade include Thor Girl, Mania, Anya Corazon as Aranya, Quake, Phyla-Vell, Carmilla Black as Scorpion, Cammy, Debris, Mariah Hill, Cloud9, Komodo, Excalibur, and Slingshot. Outside of comics, Marvel continued to produce various animated shows, with Jean Grey, Storm, Rogue, Kitty Pryde, Invisible Woman, Emma Frost, Miss Marvel, and Scarlet Witch, each starring in at least one series. Also of note is X-23, who made her debut in X-Men Evolution before making her comic debut in the same decade. With Marvel's increasing presence in Hollywood, several heroines made their movie debuts, including Jean Grey, Storm, Rogue, and Kitty Pryde in the X-Men films, the Invisible Woman in the Fantastic Four films, and Elektra in Daredevil, before starring in her own self-titled movie. The 2010s were the first decade where women heroes were finally treated as equals to men. Women were seen as leaders, powerhouses, geniuses, and complex figures that did not need to be sexualized in order to remain prominent. Former love interests were re-established as heroes. Pepper Potts became Rescue, Betty Ross became Red She-Hulk, Gwen Stacy became Spider-Gwen in an alternate reality, and Jane Foster became the Mighty Thor and Valkyrie. Other heroines also took up new titles, with X-23 becoming Wolverine, Kitty Pryde briefly becoming Star-Lord, and Carol Danvers becoming Captain Marvel. These heroes are known as legacy heroes for taking up already existing mantles. Other brand new legacy heroes included Kamala Khan as Miss Marvel, America Chavez as Miss America, Ava Ayala as White Tiger, Alejandra Jones as Ghost Rider, Nadia Van Dyne as the Wasp, and Cela Burke as Sun Girl. Most of these women are young, as Marvel heavily focused on new young heroes in this decade, with others including Finesse, Hazmat, Oya, Tempest, Hummingbird, Deathlocket, Gwenpool, Synapse, Moon Girl, Viv Vision, Ironheart, Gabby Kinney, and Starling. Nadia Van Dyne, Moon Girl, and Ironheart are noteworthy for being geniuses, as few women had been portrayed as such in prior comics. Ms. Marvel, a Muslim Pakistani hero, and America Chavez, a lesbian Latina, are also noteworthy as major characters positively representing communities rarely seen in previous comics. Angela was another new lesbian hero, while Penny Parker, Silk, White Fox, Arrow, Wave, and Luna Snow were all new Asian heroes. Other new women heroes included Smasher, Tamara DeVoe as Captain Universe, Dr. Tony Ho as Iron Patriot, Singularity, Demon Rider, Voyager, and Star. With the Avengers overtaking the X-Men as Marvel's most popular team, many women joined the roster, including Jessica Drew as Spider-Woman, Valkyrie, Jessica Jones, Storm, Quake, Captain Universe, Smasher, Rogue, White Tiger, Jane Foster as Mighty Thor, Ms. Marvel, Synapse, and Nadia Van Dyne as Wasp. Also of note is A-Force, the all-women Avengers team led by She-Hulk, with a roster made up of Captain Marvel, Dazzler, Medusa, Singularity, and Nico Minoru. A-Force disbanded during Civil War II, a massive comic event that showcased women and men on equal footing by pitting Captain Marvel against Iron Man as leaders of the opposing sides. This event elevated Captain Marvel's status to, arguably, becoming Marvel's signature woman hero. Following Civil War II, Ms. Marvel created a new hero team, the Champions, proving herself to be a capable leader and major player in the Marvel Universe. The X-Men had a quieter decade, but the 2013 X-Men team is noteworthy as the first X-Men team made up of all women, with a roster of Kitty Pryde, Rogue, Psylocke, Rachel Summers, Jubilee, and Storm as team leader. Additionally, Betsy Braddock and Quanon finally returned to their original bodies, correcting one of X-Men's most controversial storylines. This decade had by far the most women-led solo comics, including Jackpot, Black Cat, Black Widow, Anya Corazon as Spider-Girl, Hawkeye, Captain Marvel, Red She-Hulk, Angela, Elektra, She-Hulk, Ms. Marvel, Storm, Jessica Drew as Spider-Woman, Jane Foster as Mighty Thor and Valkyrie, Squirrel Girl, Silk, Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur, Scarlet Witch, Spider-Gwen, Hellcat, Gwenpool, Mockingbird, Jessica Jones, Wolverine, Gamora, America Chavez, Nadia Van Dyne as Wasp, Jean Grey, Ironheart, Daughters of the Dragon, Domino, Shuri, Invisible Woman, Arrow, and Mary Jane. Many of these series received critical acclaim, such as Ms. Marvel, Spider-Gwen, Hawkeye, and Squirrel Girl. Outside of comics, Marvel released several animated shows, with Wasp, Carol Danvers as Ms. Marvel and Captain Marvel, White Tiger, Black Widow, Kamala Khan as Ms. Marvel, She-Hulk, Gamora, Spider-Gwen, and Anya Corazon as Spider-Girl, each starring in at least one series. At the movies, heroines gained far more importance as the decade progressed. Fox's Marvel films featured Mystique, Angel Salvador, Yukio, Storm, Kitty Pryde, Blink, Negasonic Teenage Warhead, Jean Grey, Psylocke, X-23, Domino, and Invisible Woman. In the MCU's first two phases, Black Widow, Gamora, and Scarlet Witch were its only women heroes, but Phase 3 introduced many more, including Mantis, Nebula, Valkyrie, Shuri, and Okoye. In 2018, Wasp became the MCU's first heroine to co-lead a film with Ant-Man and the Wasp, followed the next year by Captain Marvel, the MCU's first solo woman superhero film. Counting shows, Agent Peggy Carter and Jessica Jones also received their own projects within the MCU, with Dagger co-starring in Cloak and Dagger. Many other women heroes appeared in Marvel's shows, including Quake, Elektra, Misty Knight, Colleen Wing, Nico Minoru, and Carolina Dean. By the current decade, Marvel's women heroes have solidly been established as men's equals in nearly every way. There are definitely still more men overall, but women heroes are no longer automatically weaker than men, or underrepresented as lead characters. Women heroes continue to adopt new mantles, such as Echo becoming Phoenix, Elektra becoming Daredevil, and Betsy Braddock becoming Captain Britain. Women heroes are more powerful than ever before, with Storm becoming Regent of Mars, Clea gaining the title of Sorcerer Supreme, and Scarlet Witch defeating the creator of Chaos Magic, who previously controlled her. Even Mary Jane has been given her own set of powers. New heroines continue to be introduced, such as Starbrand, Iska the Unbeaten, Runia the Valkyrie, Binary, Bloodline, and Hollow's Eve. Just a few years into the decade, there are already more women-led comics than in most previous decades, with comics for Captain Marvel, Star, Spider-Woman, Black Cat, Black Widow, Nebula, Gwen Stacy, Jessica Jones, Hawkeye, America Chavez, the Valkyries, Silk, Ms. Marvel, Echo, Daredevil, Clea Strange, She-Hulk, Captain Carter, Spider-Gwen, Monica Rambeau, Mary Jane and Black Cat, Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur, Scarlet Witch, Wasp, Captain Britain, Storm, Bloodline, Hallows' Eve, Rogue and Gambit, X-23, and Hellcat. Outside of comics, Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur has become Marvel's first women-led animated series since Spider-Woman in 1979. In other animation, Captain Carter and Black Widow played major roles in What If. Phase 4 of the MCU began with the long-awaited Black Widow movie, after a decade of Black Widow appearing in supporting roles as the MCU's most prominent women hero. Several other women-led projects have released within this phase, including WandaVision, Eternals, Hawkeye, Ms. Marvel, She-Hulk Attorney at Law, and Black Panther: Wakanda Forever. Prominent women heroes of the phase include Scarlet Witch, Monica Rambeau, Sylvie, Black Widow, Yelena Belova, Cersei, Athena, Kate Bishop, Scarlet Scarab, America Chavez, Miss Marvel, Mighty Thor, She-Hulk, Elsa Bloodstone, Shuri, Okoye, and Ironheart. Phase 5 has begun with Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, placing 2 Wasps in lead roles, and the rest of the phase looks to continue putting women heroes front and center, with the Marvels, Echo, Ironheart, and Agatha, Coven of Chaos, all featuring women leads. Sony will also release their first women-led Marvel projects, with the Madam Web movie and Silk Show coming soon. Marvel's women heroes have endured a turbulent journey, cycling between times of positive and negative representation throughout Marvel's 80-year history. Despite a promising start in the Golden Age, heroines took a step back thanks to the Comics Code Authority. By the 80s, women heroes had earned leadership roles and could be found throughout the Marvel Universe. But the 90s reversed some of these positive strides by focusing on over-sexualization. Luckily, the 21st century has finally elevated women heroes to equal status with men, even starring in several of their own films and shows. Overall, women heroes have come a long way, proving their importance to the Marvel Universe as leaders, powerhouses, geniuses, and any of the other complex roles that reflect the real-life diversity of women as heroes. Many of my personal favorite heroes are women, as I'm sure is the case with many Marvel fans of all genders. As heroines continue to grow in popularity and overall visibility, I'm excited to see what the future holds for Marvel's many wonderful women superheroes. Wow, there's so many awesome women superheroes at Marvel. I'd love to get a chance to talk about some of them in more depth, or maybe a group of them in more depth. If you'd like to see that, let me know which suggestions you have. And if you like this type of video, check out this video over here on the history of Marvel's Black superheroes. Otherwise, check out any of the other Marvelous videos we have, and thanks for joining me. Have a great day. Bye.